Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karim Harji, the Program Director of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program. We're just about to get started. I know people are still joining. So welcome, everyone, regardless of where you are calling from around the world. This webinar is part of a series of leading practices and issues in impact measurement. And today we're going to be talking about lean data and impact management. This is part of our engagement and outreach with the program, which is a new executive education program at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. We'll talk more about the program a little bit later, but this webinar is meant to give a bit of a preview into some of the types of questions and issues we'll be talking about. But for many of you who we've had on our first webinar, there's also a lot of interest in how practical tools and approaches are being applied in impact measurement. And so we're really glad to see that there's a high level of interest in the webinar, almost 400 people registered from 65 different countries. So we'll talk a little bit about, just to set the webinar up, I'll introduce the next couple of speakers who are joining us today, and then we will have time for Q&A later. So if we just move to the next slide, by way of context, we know that all organizations have impact, but there's a growing interest in understanding and measuring these various dimensions of impact, whether you're an investor, a funder, an employee, a customer, beneficiary, or a community. And one of the other pieces that's really important, and we'll talk more about this in the webinar, is that impact measurement is more than just collecting data. Really, it's a set of tools, frameworks, approaches, principles to try and understand why impact matters, for whom, and to really bring a set of practices around making better decisions with all stakeholders. And today we're going to profile two of the leading initiatives in this area, impact management and lean data. We're pleased to have Olivia Prentice from the Impact Management Project and Tom Adams from Lean Data join us today. We just move to the next slide. I wanted to frame some of how we talk about these issues within the program, and then specifically some of the questions that tend to come up in this area. So this is a broad overview of the program where we talk about how to build your roadmap or your strategy, how to incorporate the perspectives of different stakeholders, and to then understand what types of evidence and data are required. And we have both the Impact Management Project and Lean Data fit very nicely within that middle piece around setting and managing expectations, understanding the different perspectives, and then looking at different forms of data to make better decisions. On the next slide, these are some of the kinds of questions that we have seen both within our program and then from many of you who joined our first webinar. Some of those include: what kinds of impacts should I target? How do I set and manage expectations around what impact is and for whom? How do I translate my intentions into action? If you have a theory of change, if you have a set of objectives, how do you really translate those into something actionable? And how do you use these practices to align expectations with your partners? So whether you're an investor, an enterprise, or an intermediary. Those are one set of questions. The second set of questions tend to be around how you collect data to make better decisions. So some of the common questions include: how should we be tracking information and data and why? What are the things we should be collecting or not? We have a lot of questions also around aggregating and reporting data. How do you do this well? There's a set of questions as well around making data useful for decision making. So moving away from just collecting data to really then using it in all the right ways. And importantly as well, how do we listen to the range of customers and beneficiaries that we work with and that we want to continue to engage fully? So these are some of the questions that you'll see both the Impact Management Project and Lean Data address in terms of their specific approaches and solutions. So on the next slide, this is our agenda. I provided a bit of an overview and some introductions. For those of you that want a bit more information about some of the broad principles and practices around impact measurement, we have some information on our site. Both Olivia and Tom will frame their approaches and provide a bit of an introduction as well. And then we'll have time for Q&A. You can submit questions via the chat box, but also via email. And we look forward to hearing from you in the second half of the webinar. So let me introduce our speakers. And we have two great panelists here who are going to share some of the work they've been doing and leading in impact measurement. So first up is Olivia Prentice, who is a manager with Bridges Impact Plus team, and she's focused on the impact management project. Olivia specializes in helping organizations to design and enhance their impact measurement and management strategies across multiple geographies and sectors. She's worked previously with the CDC, the UK's Development Finance Institution, on looking at development impacts. And through the Impact Management Project, which is a collaborative effort by over 1,000 organizations, she's going to talk to us a little bit about how they came to a process of agreeing on shared fundamentals for how we talk about, measure, and manage impact. And Olivia will provide a bit of a use case around the dimensions of the Impact Management Project, why they matter for setting expectations, and how to translate these intentions into reality with an example from investors. So maybe I'll hand it over to Olivia now to start her presentation, and then I'll come back in to introduce Tom in our second part of the presentation. So Olivia, over to you to talk about the Impact Management Project.
Thanks very much, Karim. So yes, as Karim said, today I'm going to cover the rationale for the project and then dive into the investors' perspective specifically. Now, just to say, I'm going to cover a lot of content very quickly, so please be reassured there's a lot more resources on our website. So flicking onto the first slide, and the next one, this is just a diagram to explain the rationale for the projects. So as Karim said, people are experiencing effects as the result of an enterprise all the time. And there have been approaches for many years leading the charge to track and understand these effects. Listed there on the right are just some of those. And they're all collaborating with others to broaden our understanding of the experience of people and planet. There are also different enterprises doing different things through different organizational forms, as shown there. And then different labels used to describe the investment types that can support these organizational forms and funding needs. And then finally, we have lots of different investors with very different intentions, ranging from risk mitigation to the desire to tackle a particular social environmental problem. So what does this mean for impact management? This means that as investors, we need to translate our intentions into the impact goals of an investment, and then match those with the goals of an enterprise, and then learn whether those goals are being met by collecting data to understand the experience of people and the planet. So to do that, we as a team just realized that we needed shared fundamentals, a shared way of describing and classifying impact. At the moment, that doesn't exist in the market, and it's leading to an inability to match product or capital with the end organization, and therefore the people that need impact aren't getting it. So only if we all speak the same language can we organize into chains, sort of value chains, capital chains, where we all understand each other and we're all working towards the same goals. And this is when impact management can happen. So briefly, what did we do to try and agree this consensus? You see the next slide. There's a illustration here of the diverse funders, from foundations to asset owners to corporates, who all recognize the same challenge. And over a year period, we held hundreds of conversations to agree consensus on norms for impact management. Fundamental to this was to bring together a range of disciplines and diverse perspectives. So there have been more than 1,000 involved to date, but importantly, these are from a much more diverse set of organizations than illustrated here. They were practitioners from across the capital chain, including policymakers, multinational corporations, evaluators, and all types of investors globally. On the next slide is a brief update on where we're at with this work. We're currently working on 3 broad things. Firstly, embedding what was agreed in existing market infrastructure, such as IRIS and BLAB, and signposting where these resources align so that people can navigate this field of tools easier. Secondly, we're building out case studies to provide detailed guidance around some pain points, which I'll talk about. And then thirdly, we're figuring out the long-term goal and home of this work. So flicking to the next slide, I wanted to note that the majority of this presentation will focus on what the impact management looks like as an investor. Next slide. But it's important to mention this very much ties in with what is needed with impact management as an enterprise, which I know Tom will talk more about. So through the project, it was agreed that our ability to deliver and improve impact is guided by a number of things. We need to understand the material effects experienced by people and planet. We need to know what our intentions and constraints are. And we need to set goals, both financial and impact, and then reset them as we learn from delivering and improving impact. This diagram here are the components, the 4 component parts of impact management, but it's not a linear process. In fact, it's very iterative, and we can enter this process at very different points, depending on who we are. We also need very different levels and types of information to iterate between all these points, depending on who we are. So for a frontline business, we might iterate between delivering and improving, setting goals and understanding very regularly. If we're a large institutional investor, we might only be able to iterate less regularly when we get the data. So on the next slide, this is just to put together, from the investor's perspective, what the typical process is of impact management. So whether we're building a portfolio from scratch or trying to understand the impact of an existing one, we tend to follow these broad 3 steps. First, we'll seek to collect information about the impact people and planet are experiencing through our portfolio, or what they want and need for a new portfolio, rather than plucking intentions from the air. We do this so that we can set goals, either high level or very specific, to deliver these, depending on our constraints as an investor, of course, which was often factored in. And then we use these goals to select investments with greatest potential to deliver against our impact and financial goals. We then collect data to understand all of the effects, not just those we intend. And Tom will talk more about methods to do this. So on the next slide, I want to take you through these steps in slightly more detail. So sort of step 1, collecting information from people and planet. Through the project, we heard that we need data across 5 areas, which I'll call the 5 dimensions in this presentation, to understand the impact delivered. So these are the 5 dimensions that are required to understand the experience of people and planet. Firstly, which groups of people or the planet need which outcomes, which I'll refer to as the what and the who. How many people are not able to achieve the outcomes, and how deep a change do they need to experience if they're to achieve them? That's the how much dimension, which also could include duration of the effect and the rate of the effect. And then what is the market or ecosystem currently doing to help those people to achieve those outcomes, and can we contribute as an enterprise or as an investor? And we'll talk about the investor contribution separately, but this dimension, it's probably worth noting, is also referred to as additionality sometimes. And then finally, impact risk. What is the risk to people and planet that the impact is not delivered as expected? So on the next slide, we found that impact performance of an enterprise across these 5 dimensions can actually be grouped into 3 categories, which can be matched with investor intention. So we might choose to avoid harm, which involves minimizing important negative effects for people or the planet who are currently experiencing them. So for example, this could be a business that at least pays all employees a minimum wage. Enterprises that benefit people and planet contribute to important positive outcomes, but at varying levels of depth and scale, usually for people not necessarily underserved with relation to that outcome. So they might not be in such a level of need. This might be a business that pays their employees a living wage, for example, or has better than market employment practices. And then finally, enterprises that contribute to solutions are those that contribute to specific important positive outcomes for underserved people or the planet. And to be clear here, underserved means that they do not have the outcome that they need, not necessarily that they are low income. It's important to note. It's always in relation to the outcome. And that those outcomes therefore contribute to solutions are delivered at a significant depth, scale, or duration. So this could be a business, to follow the employment theme, that hires previously incarcerated people and helps them into employment. So depending on the type of investor we are, we might therefore either set goals to deliver a certain percentage of each high-level category within a large portfolio, or set very specific goals against each of the 5 dimensions to learn more about the type of impact that we can deliver through the capital we provide. So on the next slide, separate to understanding our impact goals at the enterprise level, we also consider the contribution we want to make to that impact as investors. Now, this is very separate. And often the contribution that we're able to make as an investor is a function of both our intentions, what we want to achieve, and our constraints, what our capital, what our market circumstances allow us to create. So for example, can we be, or do we want to be, an active investor, or do we need to be passive? Do we need a lot of liquidity? Are we comfortable taking on a perception of higher risk or complexity to grow new markets? So these considerations enable us to categorize our investor contribution in 4 high-level buckets, as illustrated on the next slide. And there are a couple of examples here of the types of investments that you might see under each of these. So we talk about signaling, engaging actively, growing new unsupplied capital markets, and providing flexible capital. And here are a few examples, but in interest of time, I'm going to skip over to the next slide, which brings these two sets of goals together. So the investor contribution, different categories and different combinations on the left, and then across the top on the x-axis, we've got the impact goals of the business. So each box of this matrix is therefore a type of investment that at least does no harm. So if you invest in companies which don't have data or contribute to negative effects, then it won't be able to be populated on this matrix. And you can see some examples there in each box of investment products typically seen. So articulating our goals across the 5 dimensions and our investor contribution, therefore, as investors, allows us, without using complicated labels, but instead basing it on the actual data from people and planet, allows us to classify what class of investments we're seeking. And then more importantly, match the goals of our investment product with our own. Through the Impact Management Project, we're actually currently working to populate a live version of this matrix with real product so that it can be used as more of a database for investors to search for product aligned with their goals. So do be in touch if you'd like to be part of this work. So on the next slide, we have an illustration of how this matrix can also be used to map multi-asset class portfolios. So this is PGGM, the Dutch asset manager's multi-billion-dollar portfolio. And you'll see that because PGGM isn't a fiduciary investor, the bottom 2 rows were unpopulated and have been left off. Interestingly, PGGM mapped the strategy of their portfolio of investments to contribute to the SDGs. But what they found by looking at the actual data was that these investments were actually plotted across both of the middle and the right-hand benefit and contribute columns because they hadn't considered all dimensions of impact. And so they weren't actually delivering as deep impact as they expected. And there's much more detail on a paper which is on the website, and I'm sure Karim can help circulate. So on the next slide, following this process into step 2, once the impact goals of the portfolio have been identified, we can then consider what data is needed to understand performance and set thresholds or investment criteria to help test whether the potential investment meets the required level of performance. So, for example, within one outcome area, such as employment, the investor will review and compare data, perhaps against an industry benchmark where available, to understand how significantly this outcome is driven and the demographics of the people employed. So on the next slide, that was animated, exciting. On the next slide, though, from here, the investor will also consider what level of impact risks they're willing to accept. So impact risk is the risk that impact is different than expected from the perspective of people on the planet who are affected. This can be thought about alongside some of the financial risks and can sometimes have kind of different conclusions coming out from this analysis. So the risks listed here, again, there's more on this on the website, but these are the common impact risk factors that were heard through the project that might be considered, such as what level of evidence do I require at investment, that the enterprise activities will lead to the outputs and then the expected outcomes, or what is the risk that the effects won't be as long-lasting as needed, which is drop-off risk. Importantly, for impact management, risk assessments also help us figure out where our resources should be focused for impact measurement and data collection. So on to the next slide. Once we've set these goals, and once we've understood our risk threshold we want to take as an investor, this enables investors to select and assess investment opportunities from the available pool that meet these financial goals and impact goals. And typically this involves collecting data across the 5 dimensions. So on the left here is the type of data needed for each dimension. And then the sliders on the right are intended to illustrate the assessment that happens when you compare what impact you expect or your analysis has suggested that people need with the impact delivered by a particular asset or enterprise that you're assessing or diligencing. So on to the next slide. I wanted just to note really importantly, though, that when making an investment decision and after the investment is made, we need data on all effects experienced by people and planet, not just those we intend. So although this looks like a really funky diagram, on the right-hand side here might be the effect for, decent work for people, that might be the effect we intend. But actually, there might be a load of other effects that are happening that might be also material to either the planet or people. And we need to consider these in all of our impact management decision-making. This way we can be sure that the enterprise is working to mitigate or minimize negative effects. And we also might choose as investors, again, to support the enterprise in prioritizing and improving other positive effects, depending on our intentions and constraints. So practically speaking then, on the next slide, the third step is to collect data from the enterprise. So importantly here, we heard through the project that as investors, we should not be deciding what indicators or metrics an enterprise should use, but instead we should ask the data across all of the 5 dimensions so that we can assess and benchmark each effect. This is a sort of illustration of the type of data we might collect, and importantly, the explanation and judgment of performance, which can be discussed between the investor and the enterprise. On the next slide then, I wanted to illustrate as well that, of course, we collect data, about all effects occurring, not just what we expect or intend. And Tom will talk a lot more about approaches to collecting data to make sure we're not being too intentional as investors and missing some of the important effects being delivered. On the next slide then, and this is all illustrative, but there's more of this coming out soon from the project, this enterprise impact data can be summarized into a portfolio, what we've called impact statement of effects. This is important because it allows the investor to review all of the effects that align with their goals and those that don't necessarily, and then make impact management decisions, be it to engage with the company, to improve performance, or to reallocate to a different product. This is sort of the impact equivalent of a financial statement, so that we have all of the data about all of the effects to make our decisions. And then finally, to roll out one final layer on the next slide, at the portfolio level, then we can make a judgment about what all of these different effects tell us about the overall goal. So thinking back to the matrix. Now, for example, here, this data might tell us that the high-level goal is to benefit stakeholders. So this will help large asset owners who do not have the capacity or perhaps have such large portfolios that they can't look at the detailed data, but they can use these statements of effects to make judgments as to whether their high-level impact goal has been met, and then maybe look for more detail at the individual enterprise level if they want to know more. So these are all illustrations, as I said, of the types of templates that the Impact Management Project are building at the moment to tackle this pain point that we heard really strongly through the first phase of our work, as how difficult it is to summarize impact performance in a way that really gives the voice to the people who are experiencing the impact, and then build these norms into investment processes to influence what effects are managed and what data is needed. So finally then, this is an illustration of, and it's gone a little bit funky with the formatting, I'm sorry about that, but we can send a copy of this around so it's a little clearer. But this is an illustration of that portfolio construction process, right from the goal setting to data collection, and then finally to portfolio allocation decisions. We'll be producing case studies of this process in action shortly from different investor perspectives, but this is just a sort of a helpful roadmap of the 3 different areas that need to be done for an investor to build a portfolio that incorporates impact goals. So firstly, setting portfolio goals based on the experience of people, understanding what this means across the dimensions, collecting data, and then setting thresholds, and then collecting data about all of the effects contributed to in that middle box, understanding stakeholder experience, and then deciding what type of decisions are possible within the constraints of financial goals, and then finally determining a portfolio allocation where you bring together impact goals, financial goals, and of course what's available in the market there. So finally then, final slide, please do get in touch with us if you have any questions or feedback on anything covered today, or if you'd like to get more involved with the project. We are still having very open source discussions, and we have a series of more information sessions, which we call huddles. It's okay, we can go back to the information slide, coming up very soon. Thank you very much. Handing over to Tom, I think.
Thanks, Olivia. I'll jump in. It's Karim. Great presentation and examples. I think as Olivia explained, using the investor perspectives and applying the dimensions, you can use these dimensions to set goals, to manage for impact, but it's really a whole set of tools and resources that allow you to move from intentions to action at a portfolio level. This is fundamental to understanding how we can all work together to channel capital to where it can be matched to the needs, opportunities, and the broader systems change that we typically are looking for. As Olivia said, there's much more available online. The Impact Management Project has been doing some great work and has a series of publications. And so we'll send those links as well as to this presentation. Now turning over to Tom. Tom will talk about the enterprise side specifically, because some of the questions around how to collect and use data tend to be top of mind from the other side of the equation when investors are understanding, well, now that capital is flowing, what kind of impact is happening on the ground? And from an enterprise perspective, there are several dimensions around how to work with customers, beneficiaries, stakeholders, to try and understand what is happening, for whom impact is being sought and delivered, and to try and understand how to do this all efficiently. So I'll introduce Tom briefly, and he'll walk us through some of these dimensions. Lean data, to start off, is a set of approaches and tools that are designed specifically for social enterprise to provide timely data on their social performance, customer feedback, and behavior. As Tom will mention, there's heavy use of low-cost technology to communicate directly with customers, which is some of what makes this both, I think, quite innovative, but also quite timely in terms of how we're moving from data collection to actually managing for impact. Tom will talk a little bit about what this means at the decision-making for the enterprise level, as well as curating a portfolio of ventures as Acumen have done. And before I hand it over to Tom, just by way of introduction, he's the Managing Director of Lean Data, who is leading all their work around impact measurement and lean data, for which, again, on their website, you'll see a range of different publications, which we'll also link in our follow-up email. And prior to his time at Acumen, Tom worked for the UK Department for International Development, DFID, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, FCO, and was an investment banker in a prior life. So Tom, over to you to talk about lean data.
Thank you very much, Karim, and I'm very excited to share a bit about lean data to everyone on the call. Next slide, please. So we're gonna do two things. I'll introduce lean data, some of the ideas behind it, and some of the practical ways in which we execute it, and then also I will share some data, because I think most conversations around impact measurement and management often say quite esoteric and high level and don't actually show what it looks like when you collect data and the value it can create. So so part one, let's talk about lean data. So lean data is an approach to impact measurement focused on the needs of companies. And I just want to take it back to something that Karim said earlier, and why we've done this is that lean data and impact management is more, as Karim said, than just collecting data. And I think that's where we've kind of the biggest point of where we've gone wrong. There seems to be an obsession, two obsessions in the impact measurement. One is the just get a sort of eye-catching number obsession, and that tends to be, the sort of goal of impact measurement is to get the biggest number I can possibly get my hands on and put it in a big flashy marketing report with an infographic and say, there you go, that's impact measurement. Or the other is a sort of case study and maybe even formal evaluation approach, which is I'll do this once, I'll then get a number about how much impact I've created, and then I'll wave that around for the next 3 to 5 years. And both of those approaches are getting us nowhere, and they're not allowing us to really communicate with the people whose lives we're trying to hopefully trying to change, to improve, hearing their voices directly and responding to them. So the first sort of point around this is that we need to change the way we do this work, and now from a sort of top-down compliance approach, it needs to be focused around the company needs, and actually maybe more importantly the customer's perspective. So everything around lean data is on a trying to drive bottom up accountability rather than top down accountability. It's not that necessarily building frameworks is wrong, and thinking about metrics as an investor and asking people to and putting forward that those are the things you're most interested in. It's just that if you do that without listening up from the bottom up, you're not going to hear or be able to respond to people's needs and their lived experience. So I think that's the most important thing about lean data. The second thing is that we have also think that the sector in general is far too expensive, and so there's no, if you're making investments and your impact measurement costs as much as the investment or costs as much as it is to build out the business, that's just ridiculous. So we need to drive down the costs of doing this work quite considerably, and so to do that we have done a lot of investment in mobile and tech-based solutions to impact measurement, they're only getting more and more interesting, and I can talk a bit about that later on. And I'll talk about some of the practical tools we use. We also think that in our work, when you listen to a customer collecting impact measurement, you can also collect business insights at the same time. So we think about the value of our work when we deliver lean data, and so we tend to blend social and business insights in when we deliver our projects. And I think what we're really trying, our big goal for lean data is to create standardized surveys and benchmarking. The other difficult thing about impact measurement is that even if you do it and you get a metric, unlike financial metrics, which we're kind of born into, we grow up with, we understand them, we almost intuitively understand them as indicators of value. The indicators of value metrics, for anything from an improvement of a person's perception of safety, which is an impact we might want to achieve, and one I'll talk about later. We don't understand what's good, what represents a good change, and so we need to, and the good change is ultimately the value that's created, and so we will do that when we start to create benchmarks, and the way to create benchmarks is to create standard surveys. And one of the curious things in the world that holds back high quality impact measurement is it's very hard to get standardized surveys on social impact themes. And so a lot of people are reinventing the wheel every time, and therefore everyone's got different data, and no one has built sets of standardized surveys which help people get best data. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we've been doing with lean data, and it's been growing, it was founded with a few pilots in Acumen in 2014, and founded because Acumen decided that rather than asking its companies for impact data, which they struggled to do because they were dealing with lots of other things, building their businesses in difficult places around the world, and didn't have a social research team just tucked away, and so we weren't getting any data, we'd start to provide this as a service to our companies in 2014, and after a few pilots realized we were onto something with the feedback we got from our companies, and started to scale within Acumen in 2015 and 2016, and then in 2017 started to take on a lot of external clients. So to date we've worked with over 100 social enterprises around the world providing lean data, executing now over 200 projects actually, and speaking to just now over 60,000 low-income customers. Our clients include who, along with Acumen, as we provide an internal service to companies in the Acumen portfolio, include folks like a Media Network, DFID and the CDC, and some of their funds like Injaro and Energy Access Ventures, foundations like Dune and Gates, and more recently some new investors like the Soros Economic Development Fund, and hopefully a few others that are coming on to contract our services to the companies within their portfolio. There's a few publications in Stanford Social Innovation Review, and now case studies of lean data are being taught at the Harvard Business School, so that's exciting. Next slide, please. I thought I'd touch quickly on what lean data is not, because we're asked this quite a lot. It's not a case study based approach to impact measurement, and I mentioned this before, and I think this is really, really important. It's one of the things that I talk about over and over again, which is that one way you can tell whether you're doing this work wrong, impact measurement, is if you have a handful of reports about a handful of companies in your portfolio, and they're increasingly out of date, or you're using proxies from sort of unrelated companies, it would be equivalent, if you think of imagining of running a financial portfolio this way, of saying, right, well, I know the margin of company X over here, and so company Y, which looks pretty similar, I'm going to assume that the margin is exactly the same, and make my investment on an assumption that it looks exactly the same. We wouldn't do that, nor would we assume that the margin that existed 3 years ago is the same as it is today. And so often you'll see that's the case with impact measurement. Oh, this is my impact. How do you know that? Well, I did a study in 2015 and it told me that it was. You're almost certainly out of date then. Instead, what we want is data, consistent, constant data that's part of the normal part of doing business, that this is an expected part of business. It's not an infrequent one-off, but it's actually just part of business as usual, of listening to customers constantly. If you want to create social change, you should be listening about whether or not you create social change all the time. And we're going to take a while before we get there. It's not going to. We can't just turn that data on overnight, but that is the goal. The other thing about data is it's not framework or metric first. That's another clue if you're doing this wrong, is if you're starting your work by selecting metrics. It's back again to how Karim talked about the processes involved with this. It's more than just getting data. It's more than just selecting metrics. We think that you start, one of the key parts of lean data is you listen to customers themselves, and they tell you what metrics you should be collected. We ask a lot of qualitative data to understand what people tell us about their lives, and we build KPIs for companies around what customers themselves say. Lastly, we're not control trials. And I won't dwell too much on that, but that's mainly a cost issue. There's nothing wrong particularly about controls themselves, but I think RCTs have rather captured the imagination of impact measurement, and you certainly don't have to have a control or do nothing. And in many instances, it's better not to have a control. Next slide, please. So just to go through the practicalities, a lot of people ask, well, what actually do you mean by collecting data with using technology or mobile? Most of our data collection is done with phone calls, SMS, IVR, which is voice on the phone with options of to choose to respond to questions online, and some of it's in person. We've chosen these tools not because we love being distant from the people we want to talk to, although that has some advantages in terms of data you get, but because they're more cost effective. And so you can see some of the costs generally of these approaches in terms of out-of-pocket expense to implement these. And in person actually can go way more than $50 a person, especially if you're working with remote customers in remote places. They all have their own pros and cons, which I won't go into, but I think these slides are going to be shared. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just to give a flavor of what we actually use, I mean, most of our data collection is by phone. I think phone calls are a great way to collect data. And some of the others we use less frequently, things like SMS and IVR, but a growing number of data collection is done online. Part of the reason we do more phone than online or in person is Acumen invests in remote, in the global south, and often with companies serving quite remote customers, and so they won't tend to have online. But we're seeing growth in that, and that's a very good way to collect data. And we still do a fair amount in person. Eagle-eyed listeners will spot that the percentage usages add up to more than 100%. That's because often or sometimes in projects we're using a combination. And just to give you a sense of who we use, I mean, so in Lean Data we design the survey approaches and the survey tools, and we oversee the execution. And sometimes we're using our own teams. We've built teams around the world to do phone surveys and in-person surveys. They're people that we have trained and now recruit, but often we're using third-party providers. So sometimes for phone calls, we'll use someone like a Geopole, or in Kenya, a TechnoBrain, or SMS, we'll use a platform, a web platform like mSurvey or Echo Mobile, similarly online, Qualtrics, Typeform. So there are a lot, and these are just a handful of them. There are a huge number of really great online platforms that you can use to quickly collect data. Next slide, please. So in a sentence, Lean Data, new mindset, take an enabled approach to impact, and designed specifically for social enterprises to build customer centricity and impact measurement into business as usual. Next slide. So I think I'll get into some data now very quickly, and we'll come back to it. So I'll just spend a perhaps highlight just a couple of things, but just to see. I'm going to talk about, next slide, a piece of data collection we did last year, where we offered all our companies in the Acumen portfolio, energy portfolio, and many outside to take part in a simultaneous data collection exercise in the energy sector, so that we could collect data from new customers of all these companies, plus another 11 outside of our portfolio, asking the same questions, standardized surveys at the same time, so we could get comparable data collection. And I'll take you through that and some of the benchmarks we created. So next slide, please. Just to touch quickly, in terms of, in fact, an overarching framework of the data that we collect, we can bucket in sort of 3 ways. This is our framework, which we think is kind of simple, intuitive, flexible. We focus on frameworks that aren't too over the top. And so in Acumen, we're thinking about a breadth of number of people we reach, how much change, the depth they've experienced, depth of change of impact they've experienced. And because we're a poverty alleviation organization, we want to reach customers who are poorer and work with companies that are penetrating further into their markets. Next slide, please. Okay, quickly some metrics. This has moved slightly, the formatting, but we've collected data on all these metrics. And I to link to Olivia's slides, these cover several dimensions of the impact management program dimensions that look at who's impacted, what change they've experienced, how much change they've experienced, what sort of contribution the company itself has made, and also whether any of these indicators give a sense of impact risk to the future. Next slide, please. And now some data. Right, well, this is where it gets quite exciting. These are examples of companies looking, and we're trying to define what inclusive business is. And this is back to the part of the Acumen impact framework around poverty focus. So we want to understand whether or not a company is reaching further down into the markets that they're working in. Now, this on the y-axis, this is the population of 0 to 100% of customers, and on the x-axis is these customers at different poverty thresholds. And you can see the dotted black line is the average. And you can also put country averages in here too, draw country lines. But so if you took the line that's to the far extreme left, you could see that company, somewhere like 53% of its customers are serving people below $1.09 a day. Whereas the company to the far right, that line, only maybe 2% of its customers are serving people below $1.09 a day. What's exciting about this is you can see the variation of companies. Some are penetrating really far into markets, serving the poorer people, and some are not. And we place a higher value in terms of the impact we're creating on companies that are reaching poorer people. And so we're now, by collecting data like this, can start to compare and contrast and benchmark performance. And it's just like thinking about that with financial performance. Our companies are very different, and we're getting it. We can think about the spread of change, and we can also compare these lines, as I said, to country averages and create things like inclusivity scores that give us a real sense of who is our most impactful company and who is our least. Next slide, please. I'll skip this one. This is just some benchmarks created on energy savings. So this next, the other, reaching the poor is one thing. We're also very focused on the lived experience of those customers, listening to their lives and understanding relative impact here. So we've spent quite a lot of time investigating household welfare. This is a spider chart, and it helps us understand and compare the performance of different companies. There are 3 areas within the spider chart. There is a dark grey area in the middle, which is if we can create negative impact, which we certainly is possible. A light grey area, which shows positive impact, but beneath the benchmark, which would obviously be 100%. And then a white area, which is a company that scores outsized impact. And we have different metrics. This one here improves safety on this chart around the spider chart, and we can compare the performance of different companies against a bunch of metrics. So next slide, and I'll show you how they do. Here are 3 companies in the cookstove sector against 5 of these metrics distributed in the spider chart. And a few things you can see here. One of the things that's most interesting to us is how different they are. This is a really, really important part about impact measurement that we continue to discover, and also undermines the case study-based approach I mentioned earlier, is that companies delivering similar products and services can create fairly significantly different impacts. So if you're assuming your impact based on someone else's study, you're probably wildly under or overestimating the impact. Second thing is some of these guys have created negative impact, as you can see that middle company. And the third is that we can use these sizes, these shapes, and you can turn the shape into a number, into a composite index to compare impact across these companies. Next slide, please. And so what does it look like for a company? This is my last slide. For an investor, we can now, based on this company, on this data, really start to think about comparing the financial performance of our companies and the social performance of our companies, and actually rank them both by financial performance and also by social performance as a composite index of our framework indicator breadth, depth, and poverty focus, some of the data I've taken you through. And it becomes pretty interesting because here's all our companies. At first, this looks like just a mash of dots and nothing really showing anything. But we start to think about the stage of the company, and we can start to look at potential frontiers of impact that we might expect and trade-offs within a particular company stage between impact performance and social performance. Some of the things that are particularly interesting to me that jump out is that yes, our company that's scaled the most is doing, and quite unsurprisingly, very well in both financial performance and pleasingly impact performance as well. But the company that's ranked second impact in terms of our impact performance is actually quite an early stage company, which is our 8th best in terms of financial performance. So it doesn't tell us whether they're trade-offs necessarily. It's not particularly like that there are always trade-offs or there are never trade-offs. It tells us that context is important, which is one of the things we've always thought of. I will stop there because that's enough data, and we've taken a bit of time. So back to you, Karim.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So that was great, and I think as all of you who are participating will recognize, there's a lot more underneath all of what Tom has shared. And as you'll see in some of the publications that we will send you and the links here, there are a range of toolkits available around how you do this for your own organization, whether you're an investor, an enterprise, an incubator, an accelerator, an intermediary. There are many of those groups all using and testing and adapting these tools around lean data. So I'd encourage you to take a look at some of the links that we will share shortly. And then one final point before we jump into the Q&A is that, as Tom alluded to, there has been a publication and an attempt to try and bring both the impact management project dimensions together with lean data. And there's a publication that we will link to on our follow-up email around how this has been applied in the renewable energy and clean energy space. And so again, for those of you that are interested in all of this, I encourage you to look at both of these approaches separately, but there's also now a publication that shows how you could bridge them. And I think what's exciting is that regardless of where you sit in this ecosystem, investor, entrepreneur, philanthropist, government, etc., there is something here for you. There are some starting points, there are some tools and approaches that have been validated and continue to be improved. And also there's a community of practice, both around lean data and the impact management project. So I encourage you to both to get engaged in both initiatives, and we'll send some of that follow-up information. Let me now turn it over to Brad and Hannah from the Side Business School team, who will pose some questions to our speakers based on what you've submitted. So Brad and Hannah, over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Karim. Thank you very much to Tom and Olivia for their presentation so far. And we will jump straight into the questions. I'm Brad from the Side Business School team, and myself, Hannah. We work across our social impact portfolio of executive education programs here. So the first question is from an impact investing alumni of ours who joined us last year from Australia. Rene asks, is there a single regulator for impact measurement and organizations that operate on the space area accountable to? For example, we have a stock exchange in each country that every listed organization is accountable to for profit or loss. As far as I can see, Mark Campanale, who teaches on our social finance program, has developed the Carbon Tracker initiative, but I'm not sure where else does one go to for reporting and stats on performance and goal measurement, etc. Would that be the OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development?
So maybe I'll jump in on this one, Brad. I think the short answer is no. We do have, I think, within each country an ecosystem usually that's quite fragmented around impact measurement and management. I think one of the objectives of the impact management project has been to bring many of these groups together. Probably, I think, the most wide-ranging initiative, certainly in impact investing, but even more broadly to date. So I think that as we look at the different kinds of logos and stakeholders that Olivia pointed out early on in our presentation, I think you're beginning to see the beginnings of groups coming together in a more organized and systematic way. But I think the short answer is no. Hopefully, as Tom also mentioned, as we get more benchmarking data and more standardized data, we can begin to think, I think, more deliberately around how we address that issue.
Great. Thank you very much for the thorough answer, Karim. I do encourage all attendees to submit your questions. Any questions you have that you would like answered, please do send them over. The next question we have, I think, will be for Tom. Does Acumen use lean data to assess investments during due diligence, or only post-investment to track social performance?
The quick answer to that is we're starting to. It was built in post-investment where we were able to spend a little bit more money doing it, and we've been driving down the costs so that we can now fold it into the costs of our due diligence process. So yes, it's lighter, even a lighter touch of lean data, but it's starting to inform which investments we do make.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. Next question, one aimed at both Tom and Olivia. So Tom, up first. You mentioned context is important. How is context represented when we are trying to build standardized metrics or frameworks?
It's a good question. It's great, good question, and it could be quite a long answer. One thing is, the point I was making about context is we see very different impacts based on context, and so assuming impacts across different places are the same, even with the same products or services, is going to be an error, and that's what most folks are doing. They're taking proxies, and proxies are going to be poor quite often, in the same way as proxies for financial performance would often be poor. I think there's a question about whether or not we start to introduce context a bit more. I think that would come to sort of some of the ideas that Olivia was talking about attribution, and the idea that if you create impact in sort of more challenging places, that impact is valued at a higher amount. We're not doing that yet because I think we want to see data collect. One of the problems is sometimes we introduce quite challenging, difficult, complex theoretical questions too early before we're even collecting any data. And we've been very clear that first collect the data, then ask the more difficult questions, of which this is a good one. But one day we might start to see norms and practices around how people weight the value of impact created higher for different contexts. And an easy example would that be there's more impact to be created in doing off-grid energy in West Africa currently than there is in East Africa because there's lower electrification rates.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. Olivia, the second part of the question. We know that measurement changes things and potentially changes the business itself. How can impact investing become a positive feedback loop for its investees?
What a wonderful question. So I think this is really at the heart of what investors are mostly struggling with that we've spoken to through the project. This is why those sort of funky diagrams I showed at the end of what we call an enterprise impact statement are really important, because what we're suggesting to get the sort of impact reporting becomes is really a roll-up of information on the actual effects collected by the enterprise, up into the investor, rather than the investor saying, I care about jobs, give me your jobs created number. Now, what that allows then is, as a business might reorient its business model to focus on maybe a different impact, a different product, a different service, as it grows, as it changes, the statement of effects it produces will also change, which means that an investor can then review that and then make a decision as to whether those effects are still what it's looking for. And ideally, even more importantly, learn more about what type of effects are actually wanted by people. You know, so often we hear stories of investors going into something thinking, I want to solve this problem, and learning that actually they're not solving they're not contributing to solving a problem that's actually most important to the people they thought they were targeting. And so they themselves change their goals to reflect that. And so that iterative nature, which is the main difference, I think it's fair to say, to financial reporting, is therefore needs to be at the heart of how impact measurement happens.
Great, thank you very much, Acumen. Sorry, Olivia. Quick couple of questions, Tom. Next to, if Acumen has aggregate information on the social performance of its investments, will this be shared with the sector more widely to create standard benchmarks for specific social interventions? So,
yeah. Well, yeah, yes, but not just shared. We have we're a service, and I think some of the open data movements, which are really important, forget that actually to ensure that the data carries on and we can continue to deliver this. We also need to be in a business model behind this. We're a business line within Acumen, so we will share information with those organisations that are using us as a service as cost effectively as we possibly can. So it's definitely a public good element of it, but it won't just be shared completely openly.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. Another question from Maria. For small social enterprises, cost of measurements is really high and divert resources away from the day-to-day operations and needs. Could you comment on measurements?
Absolutely. It's ludicrous. It's one of the things that drives me completely bonkers about this. Two things have to happen. You have to be able to, the costs have to be dramatically lower, and most importantly, the value of doing this has to outweigh the costs. Otherwise, don't bother, really, don't bother. So we have been focusing so hugely on driving down the costs so that for some organizations, we can get it down to thousands of dollars to do this work. Sometimes it's slightly more, but it is dramatically reduced. And we are focused on the fact that this is a value driver, that listening to your customers, blending social and other business insights is absolutely critical for creating customer-centric, successful companies, and that it should be something you want to do and want to pay for and not feel obliged to and out of pocket and beyond your pocket to do so.
Great, thank you very much. I've got a couple of I believe they're more statements than questions, but one about the OECD is currently coordinating its efforts to standardize measurements across the impact investing market. That's the first one. And then the second one, a series of expert meetings held by the OECD since 2016 resulted in the definition of a roadmap towards an internationally comparable data framework, including 1, a set of principles about transparency and data sharing; 2, an initial data reporting framework; 3, a database of databases of relevant existing publicly available data, coordination between major initiatives on impact management and measurement. Karim or Olivia, would you?
Yeah. It's Olivia, just to say that the Impact Management Project has also been involved in this work, and thank you to the representative from that group who sent that in, and to say that we are continuing these discussions, and through the next phase of the Impact Management Project, we really hope to work more practically speaking on building out the data infrastructure that is required. So moving on this amazing conceptual groundwork that's been set by that group. So essentially watch this space, and you expect to hear more towards the end of this year on that.
Right, thank you very much. We will attempt to answer as many questions as possible post this webinar. We've been overwhelmed by a number of questions. So we will get back to you outside of this session. So thank you very much for submitting a substantial amount of questions. I appreciate it. Just quickly moving on. So thank you to Tom and Olivia for their presentations and questions. Just quickly moving on to our social impact program portfolio, which we have been running in Oxford since 2013. The slide I've got up in front of you just distinguishes between our 3 executive programs in impact investing, our social finance program, which we launched in November last year and ran successfully for the first time, and our new impact measurement program, which Karim Harji will be leading with Alex Nichols as our academic director. So to date, we're fortunate to have attracted over, I would say, professionals from at least 62 countries, work countries, as well as nationalities. So to date, we've had almost 350 professionals, and we expect that to grow out. There will be an effort made towards the end of this year. We are hiring for a new role to bring this community together, as we've got 15 years worth of school scholars and social entrepreneurs at the business school, and we would love to connect both sides of the community together to make this one of the strongest alumni networks in the world in this area. So effort is being poured towards that at present. So this slide was prior to introducing last week's impact investing class so both those statistics have gone up since then. So our impact measurement program, our new one, this discussion was first brought to light in 2015. So it's been an absolute pleasure seeing this become a reality, and is very much needed in this field. If impact is the important component in impact investing, then this is probably one of the areas we need to be throwing our weight behind. So I've got a couple of points up on the slide. So these are some of the tangible takeaways you will receive on completing the program with us. Olivia from Bridges and Tom Adams, we will have somebody from Bridges Ventures delivering on our impact measurement program, as well as Tom will be joining us to talk about lean data in a lot more depth than he touched upon today. So we will be able to look at the global impact management project in some depth to see how that is coming together, how Bridges currently analyze